Hi, my name is Donn Felker, and I'm an independent consultant, and in this screencast we're going to cover Spark partials. Some people like to reference Spark partials as the user controls of Spark, and I would agree with that somewhat. However, I would like to add that I believe that Spark partials are more or less user controls on steroids, and we'll kind of get into that. You'll see that more or less in action over the course of the next couple of dimecasts. Now, the easiest way to get started with partials inside of Spark or to create a file inside of your views shared directory. So we have your views, and inside of our shared directory we create a file with a .spark file, and if we create it with an underscore as the first character, file name .spark, such as we have here with bar.spark, copyright.spark, etc., we've now created a partial file. And you can accept these partial files inside of your other views and render them accordingly. You can use render partial equals underscore bar and then close it out. And if we look back at our example and re-render it, we'll see here that we have this is bar right here, and this is what's returned from our bar.spark. This component right here is just a footer part of the application, which we'll get to in a minute. If we look at the bar.spark file, we see that all it is this is bar. Now, this is one way to render a Spark partial file. The more preferred method is to follow the syntax that Spark is providing, which is allowing the HTML to dominate the flow and the code to fit in seamlessly. This follows the syntax of an HTML type syntax. So here we have bar. Now what this does is actually render the bar.spark partial into the view. So this will render the exact same thing. We refresh it, we won't see any difference because it's not really changing in code, it's just a different syntactic type sugar. We could wrap this with a div, we could do all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to get too far into this, but this is an example of how you can see how it fits into the HTML. If we look at the elements here, we see the div that we just added there, and there's a closed div, and then this is bar. Now, this is not too fancy. This is kind of the same kind of stuff you can do with user controls. However, there is another option here. You can pass in variables, such as you can with user controls, into a Spark partial. We have a copyright.spark here, and the copyright Spark partial takes in a variable called endYear. The endYear could be a boolean, it could be a string, it could be an integer, etc. And all you have to do is provide that variable as an attribute to the Spark partial inside of the syntax. So what we could say is copyright endYear equals 2023, or maybe say 2030. So now what's going to happen is this bar is going to be removed because we've now removed that partial from the example 1 view. This is part of the footer, so that's going to remain the same, but now we're going to have another similar view show up, which is a copyright, and it's say 2009 to 2030 example Spark project. So if we render this, and there we can see our 2030 that we passed in as a variable. Again, this is nothing fancy. This is kind of stuff that you can do. At any point you can pass in different variables into the endYear itself. You can do them statically like we're doing here. It doesn't really matter. But where this really starts to shine is, let's take, for example, you have an application that displays a list of customers, and then on another page you display a list of companies. Both pages display an address information for the company or the customer. Now, address information is usually more or less the same. You have the address, the cities, the state, the zip, and you may have a customer object that looks like this. The customer object has the address, city, state, zip, postal code, and country. Now your company object may look something similar, but have some extra properties like company name, annual revenue, etc. Address, city, state, postal code, country. Those features are exactly the same, and they could even be implemented from an interface, from an abstract class, however your object model has been described. This is being a simple example. We have the same type of scenario here, that the company and the customer have pretty much the same signature in regards to address information. Now inside of inside of the shared directory here, we have a mailing address partial. We open the mailing address partial, and we see that the mailing address partial takes in a record which has address, city, state, postal code, and country. Now, as long as the record that's passed in follows the same signature, Spark doesn't care what type it is. It could be a customer, it could be a company, it could be a Smurf, it doesn't matter, whatever it is. As long as it follows the same signature, Spark will output the contents. So here's a perfect example. Let's go to the order views. And then we can go to the companies.spark. And companies.spark is going to loop through all the companies in the model, and the model will consist of pretty much an enumerable of companies. And for each company, we want to output its name, and then we want to output the address information. The key here is that the record is a company. So think of it, the record is the company. We look back at the mailing address.spark. We have a record, and it has these properties: address, city, state, postal code, country. So the company itself is going to provide a record. The company has address, city, state, postal code, country. If we look at the customers view looks very similar. We're going to loop through all the customers in the model right here. So the model being enumerable of customer. We're going to output the mailing address information for the customer. But this time, the record is a customer. And we know that from the model right here. Again, the mailing address information is going to be output the same. So if we go look at the route for that, customers. So we have our customers here. And notice how it says customer name, address, city, state, zip, whatever, etc., 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 etc. If we go to companies now, that renders. We actually see that this has now changed the company name because it's a different view, but we're still rendering the address, city, state, zip, postal code, country, etc. Now to prove to you that this can change, what we can actually add right here is perhaps we can add, a little HTML comment that says test to prove that both of these are going to be using the same exact mailing address. So we refresh this. We can see that there's test, etc. If we go to customers, we can see we have test all the way on here. If we were to remove that code, refresh it, look at the source again, we can now see that our test comment is gone. Not on just the customers, but also the companies. Excuse me. There's no test information shown. So this is a simple example of how you can use Spark partials to pass in information to the actual Spark partial itself, as long as your object follows the same exact signature. So you can pass in very simple object primitive types, you can pass in complex types, as long as they follow the same signature, and you can utilize Spark partials anywhere inside of your application. And the Spark partials are going to allow your application to be very modular, to break apart different pieces of functionality, to make your views maybe a little bit more easy to maintain in the long run if you have a lot of repetition throughout your development. In the next Spark Dimecast, we're going to cover a little bit more in-depth look into the Spark partials, mainly the render element, and how we can actually render contents that are being pushed from outside of the Spark partial and inject them into the Spark partial, as well as using named content areas within a Spark partial itself. Until next time, thank you.